150 million years ago, there was not a single flower on Earth, not one. Every forest, every riverbank, every open stretch of land, covered in plants that no longer exist in any recognizable form, an entire planet of green, and none of it like anything alive today. That detail alone tells you something important. The Jurassic was not just a world with different animals in it, it was a fundamentally different world. The air, the heat, the light, the sound, all of it operating under conditions that modern life has never experienced and could not simply walk into. The heat was permanent, not seasonal, permanent. There was almost no cold anywhere on the planet, pole to pole, for millions of years at a stretch. The atmosphere held more warmth and more moisture than anything alive today has ever breathed. And through all of it, through 56 million years of this, something small and warm-blooded was already alive at the edges of that world, staying out of sight, moving at night, surviving in the margins of an era that was not built for anything like it. That was our lineage, already there, already frightened, already waiting, though it would take another 150 million years for the world to become somewhere we could actually thrive. Today, we go back to that world, not just the creatures that dominated it, but the actual texture of it, what it looked like, what it sounded like at night, what a human being would feel standing inside it, and why it was stranger and wilder and more alive than most people have ever been told. Before we do, if you enjoy content like this, hit the like button and subscribe, and let me know in the comments, is it late where you are right now, or are you starting your day with this? Now, settle in, and let's begin. Time here does not move in years, but in layers. Beneath everything that lives and fades, the planet keeps its own quiet record, pressing each moment into stone. One of those layers held between older endings and later beginnings spans from 201 million to 145 million years ago. This is the Jurassic, the middle passage of the Mesozoic era, resting between the Triassic that came before and the Cretaceous that would follow. It began in absence. Before the first forests of this age settled into place, the world had already endured a loss so large it reshaped the direction of life itself. Near the boundary that separates the Triassic from the Jurassic, a mass extinction removed roughly 4 out of every 5 species. Oceans and land alike were emptied of countless lineages, leaving ecosystems fractured and open. What followed was not a simple recovery, but a gradual reassembly, as surviving forms expanded into spaces left behind, testing new shapes, new roles, new ways of living. Across the surface of the planet, the land itself was no longer still. The supercontinent, known as Pangaea, had begun to loosen its hold, its vast interior cracking along lines that would, over immense stretches of time, widen into oceans. At first, the separation was subtle, a long, narrow seaway forming between what would become distant continents. Water entered these openings slowly, turning rifts into channels, channels into young seas. The Atlantic Ocean existed only as a beginning, a thin and growing divide that would never close again. Above this shifting ground, the atmosphere carried a different balance than the one known today. Carbon dioxide moved through the air in quantities far greater than modern levels, somewhere between 4 and 8 times as much. This altered the way heat was held across the planet. Warmth did not retreat with seasons in the familiar sense. Instead, it lingered, spreading evenly across latitudes, filling even distant regions with a steady, sustained climate. There were no polar ice caps to reflect light back into space, no frozen reservoirs to cool the air. The poles remained forested, their darkness shaped by the turning of the planet rather than by cold. Within this long span of time, change still unfolded in stages. The Jurassic is divided into three parts, each with its own character. The early Jurassic carried the instability of what had come before, ecosystems still adjusting, still expanding into newly available ground. The Middle Jurassic saw increasing complexity, with environments stabilizing and interactions between species becoming more layered and intricate. By the late Jurassic, the world had reached a kind of balance, not permanent, but sustained long enough for some of the most recognizable forms of the age to emerge and persist. All of this formed a system that functioned as a whole. Energy moved from light into leaf, from leaf into body, from body into soil, and back again. Water cycled through air, land, and sea without interruption. Creatures fed, rested, reproduced, and disappeared, each one part of a larger rhythm that did not pause. Nothing existed in isolation. Every movement, from the smallest shift in climate to the presence of a single organism, influenced something else. Seen this way, the Jurassic is not defined by size or spectacle, but by continuity. It is a world that operated, moment by moment, with its own internal logic, shaped by forces both vast and subtle, unfolding across a span of time so long that it can only be understood by the traces it left behind. Color in this world does not arrive in sudden bursts. It gathers slowly, layer upon layer, until the land settles into a deep and continuous green that rarely breaks or brightens. There are no flashes of petals, no brief displays that come and go with the turning of seasons. The surface of the planet holds a steadier palette, one shaped by plants that do not rely on flowers at all. The vegetation is dominated by gymnosperms, a group whose reproduction unfolds without blossoms or fruit. Their seeds develop exposed, often held in cones or structures that open directly to the air. Cycads stand among them in great numbers, their thick trunks rising low and sturdy, crowned with stiff, radiating leaves. From a distance, they resemble a fusion of forms, something between a palm and a densely scaled cone. Their presence is not occasional or isolated. They repeat across the land in quiet abundance, forming a consistent element of the landscape that stretches beyond any single horizon. Nearby, conifers extend upward in darker tones, their needle-like leaves arranged to conserve water and endure long spans of stable warmth. Between them grow ginkgos, their fan-shaped leaves catching light in a softer pattern, moving with a slight deliberate motion. The lineage of these trees continues into the present, carried forward with minimal change across immense stretches of time. A single ginkgo leaf today still carries the same form that once unfolded in this older world, linking distant eras through a shared design. Closer to the ground, the terrain is shaped by ferns and horsetails. Ferns spread outward in dense layers, their fronds overlapping until the soil beneath becomes hidden from view. The effect is not a scattered undergrowth, but a continuous surface rising to the height of a person's waist in many places. Horsetails stand among them, jointed and upright, their structure segmented and precise, adding vertical lines to the otherwise flowing field. Movement through this environment is slow and deliberate, guided by the resistance of living growth, rather than by open paths. In the absence of flowers, the process of pollination follows different routes. Wind moves freely through these forests, carrying fine grains of pollen from one plant to another, without reliance on bright signals or sweet scents. Insects are present, but their role is quieter, less specialized than the relationships that will emerge much later. Beetles and early lineages of other insects interact with these plants, drawn not by nectar but by subtle secretions and exposed reproductive structures. The exchange is direct, unadorned, and steady. The visual character of this world reflects these relationships. Without blossoms, there are no sudden variations in color, no patches of intense brightness breaking the continuity of green. The air does not carry the drifting sweetness that flowers release. Instead, the landscape maintains a uniform depth, a consistency that feels older, less transient. Light filters through layered foliage, producing gradients rather than contrasts, soft transitions instead of sharp highlights. This structure influences every level of life that depends on it. Herbivores feed on tough, fibrous material, their bodies adapted to process leaves and stems that do not offer the concentrated energy of later plant forms. Their movement follows the distribution of these plants, guided by availability rather than by seasonal bursts of growth. Energy moves through the ecosystem in longer, steadier cycles, passing from plant to animal without the brief surges that flowering plants will one day introduce. What emerges is a world defined not by absence, but by continuity, where life unfolds without interruption, shaped by a vegetation that persists in form and function across vast stretches of time. Breath carries weight here, a quiet density that settles into the chest before it is even noticed. The air does not pass lightly over the skin or slip away unnoticed with each exhale. It lingers, full and present, as though every inhalation draws in more than simple gas, but a substance thickened by the conditions of the world itself. Oxygen moves through this atmosphere in greater proportion than it does in the present, rising to around 26% rather than 21%. This difference, subtle in number, alters the way energy flows through living systems. Each breath delivers more potential for motion, for growth, for the quiet processes that sustain life. Muscles draw on this reserve, cells respond to it, and bodies of many forms expand within its allowance. Insects reach sizes that would feel unfamiliar in later ages, their structures supported by the richness of what surrounds them, their movements sustained by an air that offers more with every exchange. Alongside this abundance of oxygen, carbon dioxide remains elevated, shaping the broader condition of the planet. Heat does not disperse as easily, held within the lower atmosphere by a greenhouse effect that persists without interruption. The variations that define cooler seasons in later worlds do not take hold in the same way. Temperature shifts exist, but they do not descend into prolonged cold. Warmth remains a constant presence, extending across latitudes, smoothing differences that might otherwise divide regions into distinct climatic zones. Moisture gathers within this warmed air, drawn upward and held in suspension. The atmosphere carries water not only as passing clouds, but as a continuous presence, a saturation that reveals itself in subtle ways. In low areas and beneath dense canopies, mist forms and lingers, softening the outlines of everything it touches. Surfaces collect condensation through the night, releasing it slowly as light returns. Rain falls with regularity, not always in violent bursts, but often in steady intervals that replenish the ground and return moisture to the cycle once more. The rhythm of the year follows this movement of water rather than shifts in temperature. Periods of greater rainfall give way to intervals where the air holds less moisture, where clouds thin and precipitation becomes less frequent. These phases create their own patterns, guiding growth and activity, shaping when certain forms of life expand or retreat. The distinction is not between warmth and cold, but between abundance and restraint, between saturation and relative dryness. Within such conditions, breathing becomes an experience shaped by both composition and climate. The air feels warmer as it enters the body, carrying with it a sense of fullness that does not dissipate quickly. Humidity adds a layer that rests against the lungs, making each inhalation more substantial, each exhalation slower to clear. Movement through this atmosphere carries a different pace, one influenced by the resistance of what surrounds every living form. This environment supports a wide range of interactions, allowing organisms to grow, to move, and to persist under a steady set of conditions. It does not fluctuate sharply, nor does it retreat into extremes that halt activity for long periods. Instead, it maintains a continuity that shapes every aspect of life, from the smallest exchange of gases within a single cell to the broad patterns that guide entire ecosystems across the surface of the Earth. In this way, the atmosphere becomes more than a background, more than an invisible medium. It is an active presence, shaping the tempo and scale of life, holding within it the conditions that allow this world to continue, moment after moment, in a steady and unbroken flow. Sound arrives here before sight, carried through air that holds it longer, allowing each vibration to travel with a certain patience. It does not scatter quickly or fade into silence without trace. Instead, it lingers, overlapping gently, building a continuous field of quiet activity that extends in all directions. Some of these sounds have been recovered in an unexpected way, not through echoes preserved in space, but through structure preserved in stone. Fossilized insects, held within fine sediments and ancient resins, retain the delicate features of organs once used to produce sound. These stridulating surfaces, the ridges and files that generated vibration, offer a record precise enough to reconstruct their tones. From such remains, a single species has been brought back into presence, Archaebolus musicus, known from a fossil dated to 165 million years ago. Its song, recreated through careful analysis, emerges as a steady, pure tone, lower and slower than the rapid pulses of modern crickets, resting around 6.4 kilohertz. This suggests a different acoustic texture to the night. Insects filled the darkness, but their collective sound did not form a high, sharp chorus. Instead, it unfolded in deeper layers, more spaced, more resonant, each tone occupying a broader interval. The effect would have been less like a constant shimmer and more like a measured sequence, a pattern of calls that moved through the air with a deliberate rhythm. Among larger animals, sound followed a different path. Evidence drawn from bone structure and comparisons with living relatives indicates that many theropods did not produce the open-mouthed roars often imagined. Their vocalizations were likely generated with the mouth closed, producing low-frequency booms that carried through the ground and air alike. These sounds would not have cut sharply through the environment, but instead traveled as slow pulses, expanding outward, sensed as much as heard, similar in character to the deep calls of crocodilians or certain large birds. For the largest animals, communication may have extended even further into ranges below direct hearing. The immense size of sauropods suggests the possibility of infrasound, vibrations too low to register as distinct tones to human ears. Such signals could pass across long distances, moving through soil and air with minimal loss, allowing individuals to remain connected even when separated by terrain or vegetation. These exchanges would not announce themselves clearly, but would exist as subtle shifts, a faint trembling carried across space. The environment itself contributed continuously to this soundscape. Air moving through conifer branches produced a sustained, flowing tone, lower in pitch and more uniform than the rustling patterns created by later vegetation. It formed a background presence, a steady current of sound that did not break but persisted, filling the spaces between other sources. Water added its own layers. Rain falling onto broad fronds created a soft, dispersed pattern, each drop absorbed and redirected across surfaces that did not produce sharp impacts. Rivers moved through channels of stone, their flows shaped by uneven beds, that created a low, continuous murmur, rising and falling with subtle variations. These sounds did not dominate, but blended into the wider field, contributing to a sense of continuity. Movement carried its own signature. The passage of a large body through dense growth produced a sequence of displaced stems and shifting weight, not sudden or abrupt, but gradual, each step altering the surrounding structure. These sounds traveled outward, merging with others, becoming part of the larger pattern rather than standing apart from it. Taken together, this world of sound forms a continuous presence, one that surrounds and permeates every space. It is neither silent nor overwhelming, but balanced, composed of layers that rise and settle without interruption, shaping an atmosphere that is heard as much as it is inhabited. The shoreline does not hold its place for long. Water presses farther inland than it does in later ages, covering low regions and spreading into basins that will one day stand dry. Sea levels rise to heights between 80 and 170 meters above those familiar to the present, reshaping the edges of continents into shifting margins where land and ocean meet without sharp boundary. Across this expanded surface, a vast body of water stretches through the center of the world, known as the Tethys Sea. It lies where continents are still parting, filling the spaces between them with warm, shallow currents that circulate slowly through broad regions. What will one day become Europe? The Middle East and Central Asia exists here as submerged terrain or scattered landforms surrounded by this continuous expanse. The water carries heat evenly, maintaining a temperature that supports life across wide latitudes without abrupt change. Within these seas, movement is constant yet measured. Marine reptiles occupy roles that later belong to entirely different groups. Ichthyosaurs move with streamlined bodies, shaped for speed, their forms converging with those of fish, despite their distant ancestry. They travel through open water with steady propulsion, their limbs transformed into fins that guide and stabilize rather than grasp. Among them, Temnodontosaurus carries eyes of remarkable scale, reaching diameters of around 26 centimeters. These structures gather faint light from depth or darkness, allowing pursuit where visibility fades and the surface becomes distant. Elsewhere, plesiosaurs move with a different rhythm. Their long necks extend forward from compact bodies, each motion of their flippers producing a smooth, gliding progression. They do not rely on bursts of speed, but on sustained, controlled movement, navigating through layers of water where prey drifts or swims in slower currents. In contrast, pliosaurs hold a heavier presence, their shorter necks and larger heads built for force, their bodies moving with deliberate strength through the same environment. Ammonites drift among them, present in numbers that fill nearly every part of the marine world. Their spiral shells vary widely in size, from small forms no larger than a coin to others approaching the span of a cartwheel. They move with subtle adjustments, regulating buoyancy as they rise or sink through the water column. Their distribution is broad, forming a continuous thread of life that links shallow regions with deeper zones, their shells later settling into sediments that preserve their presence long after the animals themselves are gone. Reef structures form in these seas, though their architecture differs from that of later periods. The organisms responsible build frameworks that do not match the shapes or compositions familiar today. Without the reef builders that will emerge in future ages, these formations take on alternative patterns, creating habitats that support a range of marine life adapted to their specific conditions. Notably absent are many of the creatures that later define ocean ecosystems. There are no whales moving through these waters, no dolphins tracing arcs along the surface, no sharks in the forms that will come to dominate later seas. The highest positions in the food web belong instead to reptiles, whose bodies have adapted fully to life within this environment, completing a return to the ocean that began long before. The result is a marine world structured along different lines, where familiar roles are filled by unfamiliar forms, and where the balance of life unfolds according to conditions that no longer exist in the same way. There are moments when scale becomes difficult to hold, when the body tries to measure what stands before it and finds no familiar comparison. In such moments, perception adjusts slowly, not by understanding, but by accepting that the usual limits no longer apply. On the land of this age, that adjustment becomes necessary. Sauropods move through their environment with a presence that exceeds anything known in later time. They are not simply large animals, but the largest to have ever lived on land across the entire history of Earth, a lineage that reached a physical scale unmatched before or since. One form, Brachiosaurus, rises to a height of around 12 meters at the shoulder, its long neck extending even further upward, allowing it to access foliage beyond the reach of other herbivores. Its mass approaches 60 tons, a weight that can be understood only through comparison, exceeding that of several modern vehicles combined. Yet its movement does not appear forced or strained. It advances with a steady, measured pace, each step placed with balance and control, its limbs supporting this mass through a structure refined over long spans of time. Another, Diplodocus, stretches outward rather than upward, its body extending to lengths of around 26 meters. Its form remains low and elongated, with a tail that narrows into a flexible extension capable of rapid motion. Evidence suggests that this tail could be accelerated with such speed that it produced a sharp, cracking sound, a release of energy that traveled through air over considerable distance. This feature, whether used in defense or communication, adds another dimension to its presence, one not immediately visible but embedded in its design. Sustaining such bodies requires a system that can support continuous intake and distribution of energy. Their feeding does not rely on chewing in the manner of later herbivores. Their teeth are simple, peg-like structures suited for stripping vegetation rather than breaking it down. Plant material is gathered and swallowed largely intact, passing into a digestive system capable of extracting nutrients through extended processing. Supporting this is a respiratory system that includes air sacs similar in function to those found in birds, allowing efficient exchange of gases and maintaining a steady supply of oxygen throughout the body. Their movement across the land leaves a record that persists long after they have passed. Trackways preserved in regions such as the Morrison Formation in what is now Colorado and in Lourinhã in present-day Portugal show patterns that extend beyond individual paths. Multiple sets of footprints align and progress together, indicating that these animals often moved in groups. Different sizes appear within the same trackways, suggesting the presence of individuals at various stages of growth, traveling alongside one another. To be near such a group is to encounter a form of motion that begins before it is seen. The ground carries the weight of their steps outward, transmitting subtle vibrations that precede their arrival. As they draw closer, the rhythm of their movement becomes clearer, a sequence of impacts spaced with consistency. Air shifts around them as they pass, displaced by their size, creating a gradual change in the immediate surroundings. Their presence does not dominate through speed or sudden action, but through scale and continuity. They move as part of the environment itself, shaping the space around them simply by existing within it, their passage leaving impressions that persist both in the ground and in the patterns of life that adapt to them. Across open ground, tension gathers in ways that are not immediately visible. It rests in stillness, in the spacing between movements, in the quiet alignment of bodies that do not rush without reason. Among the immense herbivores that shape the land, there are others moving with a different purpose, guided by a need that unfolds through patience rather than force alone. In the late Jurassic of what is now North America, Allosaurus occupies this role. It reaches lengths of around 12 meters, yet its build is not as heavy as that of later predators. Its frame is comparatively lighter, its limbs structured for balance and controlled motion rather than sheer mass. It does not carry the impression of unstoppable weight, but of precision, of an animal adapted to act with timing rather than overwhelming strength. Its method of attack appears shaped by this design. Studies of its skull, including patterns of stress and fracture preserved in bone, suggest a technique unlike the sustained biting seen in some later species. Instead, it may have used a downward motion, bringing its upper jaw sharply into contact with its target, a movement often described as a hatchet-like strike. This action would concentrate force in a brief, focused impact, allowing it to withdraw and repeat rather than maintain a prolonged grip. Evidence of such interactions exists in the remains of its prey. Bones attributed to Apatosaurus bear marks that correspond closely with the teeth of Allosaurus, indicating direct contact between predator and herbivore. These traces do not form a complete narrative, but they provide a glimpse into encounters where such animals came into conflict, leaving behind physical records of those moments. In other regions, including what is now Portugal as well as North America, another predator appears, Torvosaurus. It reaches lengths of up to 14 meters, placing it among the largest carnivores of its time. Its presence adds further variation to the predatory landscape, suggesting that more than one form occupied the upper levels of the food web, each with its own approach shaped by structure and environment. The question of how these predators operated together remains open. Trackways show multiple individuals moving across the same terrain, sometimes aligned in similar directions, suggesting that they shared space and perhaps followed common routes. Whether this indicates coordinated hunting or simply overlapping movement through areas rich in opportunity is not fully resolved. The evidence allows for both possibilities, leaving room for interpretation shaped by limited traces. Encounters between predator and prey at this scale unfold with uncertainty. A large herbivore, such as Diplodocus, presents not only a source of energy, but also a significant risk. Its size alone creates a barrier, and its tail, capable of rapid movement, introduces an additional danger. Any attempt to engage such an animal requires careful positioning and timing, as a misjudged approach could result in injury. This balance defines the relationship between these groups. Predators are not assured of success, nor are herbivores without vulnerability. Each interaction exists within a narrow margin, where outcome depends on circumstance as much as on strength or speed. The landscape holds these possibilities continuously, shaped by movements that may or may not lead to direct conflict. Within this system, predation becomes part of the broader pattern of life, not an isolated event, but a recurring element woven into the daily existence of these animals. It does not dominate every moment, but it remains present, influencing behavior, movement, and the distribution of life across the land. Above the reach of branches and open ground, another domain unfolds, one defined not by weight or contact, but by lift and balance. The air itself becomes a surface of movement, supporting forms that do not touch the earth except by choice. This space is not empty or still. It carries its own inhabitants, arranged across height and distance in ways that mirror the patterns below. Pterosaurs occupy much of this aerial world. They are not part of the dinosaur lineage, but a separate branch of reptiles that arrived at flight through their own path. Their wings are formed from extended fingers, supporting membranes that stretch outward and backward, creating surfaces capable of sustained gliding and controlled motion. They move through the air with an efficiency shaped by long refinement, their bodies light, their structures adapted to remain aloft with minimal effort. Among them, Rhamphorhynchus travels along the edges of water. Its long tail extends behind it, ending in a diamond-shaped structure that acts as a stabilizing surface, adjusting orientation as it moves. It passes low over shallow areas, its flight steady and close to the surface, where fish move beneath. At moments, it dips or adjusts its path, guided by what lies below, maintaining a connection between air and water without fully entering either. Elsewhere, Dimorphodon presents a different form. Its head appears large in proportion to its body, its skull broad and pronounced, giving it a distinct profile in flight. Its movement through the air is capable, yet its structure also allows it to navigate the ground with equal confidence. It can move on all fours, its wings folding into limbs that support its weight, allowing it to traverse surfaces that other flyers might avoid. This dual ability places it between environments, not confined to one but shifting between both as needed. In the later part of this period, another form appears, one that carries features from multiple lineages within a single body. Archaeopteryx emerges, preserved in fine detail within the limestone of what is now Bavaria, dating to around 150 million years ago. Its wings bear feathers, arranged in patterns that support flight, and its skeleton includes a wishbone, a structure associated with modern birds. Yet it retains characteristics that place it outside that group as it is known today. Teeth line its jaws, its fingers remain clawed, and its tail extends as a series of bones rather than the shortened structure seen in later species. Its presence suggests a transition, not a sudden shift, but a blending of forms, where features that will later define birds begin to assemble within an earlier framework. It moves through the air with a capability that is still developing, not as refined as later flyers, but sufficient to occupy a place within this layered system. The sky itself holds multiple levels of activity. Some species remain close to the surface, following coastlines or inland waters, while others move at greater heights, covering longer distances with broader arcs of flight. Each occupies a range suited to its structure and needs, creating a distribution that prevents direct overlap while allowing coexistence within the same space. This arrangement forms an aerial ecosystem that reflects the complexity found on land and in water. Movement occurs at different scales and speeds, guided by anatomy and environment, creating patterns that shift continuously yet remain balanced. The space above becomes an extension of the world below, not separate from it, but connected through the movement of life across all dimensions. Darkness settles without sharp edge, not as an absence, but as a gradual dimming that softens every surface it touches. The last traces of light withdraw from the upper canopy, leaving the lower world to rearrange itself in quieter ways. Shapes remain, but their boundaries loosen, and movement becomes something felt before it is clearly seen. Within this change, a different set of lives begins to unfold. Small bodies move through spaces that larger ones have left behind, tracing paths that exist beneath notice during the day. These are the early mammals, present for millions of years already, but seldom dominant, their activity shaped by avoidance as much as by need. Night offers them a condition where visibility decreases and risk shifts, allowing them to emerge from concealed places and move with greater freedom. Among them is Morganucodon, an animal no larger than a modern shrew, its form compact and agile. It moves through the layer of fallen plant material that covers the ground, navigating by scent and sound as much as by sight. Its diet consists primarily of insects, gathered from the spaces between stems and decaying fragments, each movement precise, each pause brief. It does not travel far, but it does not need to, as the resources it depends on are distributed across the surface in small, consistent amounts. Its senses are tuned to this environment. Within its skull, the structure of the ear includes 3 small bones, arranged to transmit sound with a level of sensitivity that allows it to detect subtle vibrations. This adaptation, combined with differentiated teeth suited to processing varied food and a body capable of maintaining its own temperature, forms a set of traits that define these early mammals. They do not rely on external warmth to remain active, and so their activity extends into hours when other creatures withdraw. Elsewhere, another mammal occupies a different niche. Casterocauda, known from deposits in what is now China, reaches a size comparable to a modern platypus. Its body is adapted for movement through water, with features that allow it to swim and pursue prey beneath the surface. Evidence from its remains indicates a diet that includes fish, placing it in a role that expands beyond the small, land-bound insect hunters often associated with early mammals. Its presence suggests that even within this early stage, mammals were exploring a range of environments and behaviors. The broader landscape at night holds a pattern of activity distinct from that of the day. Temperatures shift slightly, not into cold, but into a gentler range that changes how air and surface interact. Sounds move differently, carrying through spaces where daytime movement has settled. Small animals rustle through low growth, their paths intersecting and diverging without notice. Larger forms remain present, their movements slower, less frequent, as they enter periods of rest or reduced activity. This is the environment in which the lineage leading to modern mammals persists. It does not dominate or reshape the world in obvious ways, but it continues, adapting within the constraints of its time. Each movement, each feeding, each reproduction contributes to a continuity that extends forward, linking these small, largely unseen lives to those that will follow much later. In this quiet interval, beneath the larger structures of the world, a different kind of presence endures, steady and unbroken, carried through generations that remain close to the ground, moving through darkness with a consistency that does not draw attention, yet does not cease. Stone can hold a landscape long after the landscape itself has shifted beyond recognition. Layer by layer, sediments settle, compact, and harden, preserving not only the forms of living things, but the conditions that shaped them. In one region of what is now North America, this process has left behind an unusually clear record, a stretch of sedimentary rock extending across 13 modern states, known as the Morrison Formation. These layers were laid down between 156 and 146 million years ago, capturing a span of time within the later part of the Jurassic. What they preserve is not a generalized world, but a specific environment, one defined by its own patterns and constraints. The land here is not continuously dense or enclosed. It opens outward into a broad floodplain, shaped by rivers that shift their courses over time, depositing sediment in wide channels that expand and contract with changing conditions. Water moves through this landscape in cycles. During periods of higher flow, rivers spread outward, carrying fine material that settles into new layers. At other times, flow diminishes, leaving channels reduced and isolated. These fluctuations create a terrain that alternates between saturation and dryness, where standing water may persist in some areas while others remain exposed. The climate supports this variation, allowing intervals of drought to develop, followed by returns of moisture that reshape the surface once more. Vegetation reflects this openness. Rather than forming continuous enclosed forests, plant life is distributed in a way that leaves space between stands of growth. Conifers appear in clusters, rising above lower vegetation, while other plant forms occupy the ground in patterns that follow the availability of water. The overall impression is closer to a seasonally dry savanna than to a closed, humid forest, with light reaching the ground across wide areas. Within this setting, a range of species coexists, their presence recorded in bones that have settled into these sediments. Allosaurus moves through this space alongside large herbivores such as Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, and Apatosaurus. Stegosaurus appears as well, its form distinct among the others, accompanied by Camarasaurus and Ceratosaurus. Together, they form a complete ecological system, one in which feeding, movement, and interaction occur within the same shared environment. At certain locations within the Morrison Formation, bones are found in concentrated deposits known as bone beds. These are not the remains of single individuals, but of multiple animals gathered in one place. Their arrangement suggests events where groups came together, possibly drawn by diminishing water sources during extended dry periods. As conditions worsened, these areas may have become points of convergence, where animals lingered until resources were no longer sufficient to sustain them. The presence of such deposits indicates that this environment was not constant in its availability. It shifted, sometimes gradually, sometimes more abruptly, creating intervals where survival required adaptation to changing conditions. Water could become scarce, vegetation could thin, and movement across the landscape would follow these changes, concentrating life in certain areas while leaving others temporarily unoccupied. What emerges from this record is a view of the Jurassic that includes variability and constraint. It is not a uniform expanse of continuous growth, but a system shaped by cycles of abundance and limitation. Fire may have moved through these areas at times, further altering the distribution of life, though such events leave fewer direct traces. The evidence that remains points to a world where conditions changed within a broader stability, where ecosystems adjusted to fluctuations that occurred over shorter intervals. Through these layers, a single moment becomes visible, not as a frozen scene, but as a sequence of conditions preserved in detail. It offers a glimpse into how life organized itself within a specific setting, shaped by factors that extended beyond any individual species, forming a pattern that existed within the larger continuity of the Jurassic. Recognition often arrives before understanding. Some forms become familiar through repetition, their outlines fixed in memory, long before their details are carefully examined. Stegosaurus is one such presence, its silhouette unmistakable, its arrangement of plates and tail spikes widely known, yet its true nature often obscured by earlier interpretations that linger beyond their accuracy. Its most striking feature rises along its back, a series of large plates arranged in alternating rows. For a long time, these structures were imagined as armor, protective shields set against attack. Closer study reveals a different function. Within each plate, a network of blood vessels runs densely, forming channels that connect the surface to the interior. This pattern suggests a role tied not to defense, but to regulation and display. Blood moving through these plates could release heat or absorb it, adjusting the animal's internal temperature in response to its surroundings. At the same time, Changes in blood flow would alter their appearance, shifting their color as circulation increased or decreased. Beneath this external structure, the internal system of Stegosaurus follows a pattern that differs from expectations shaped by later animals. Its brain is relatively small in size, around 80 grams, roughly comparable to a walnut. This fact once led to assumptions about limited capability, but such conclusions overlook the broader arrangement of its nervous system. Along the length of its body, particularly in the region of the hips, there exists a secondary enlargement of neural tissue. This distribution allows for coordination and control across a large frame, reducing reliance on a single central structure and enabling movement that remains stable and responsive. At the end of its tail, another feature extends outward, a set of spikes arranged in a configuration known as a thagomizer. These structures serve a direct purpose, forming an active defense capable of inflicting significant damage. Evidence of their use appears in the fossil record, where bones of Allosaurus bear puncture marks that correspond in size and spacing to these spikes. Such traces indicate encounters where Stegosaurus was not passive, but capable of responding with force when threatened. The placement of this animal within time further shifts its context. Stegosaurus lived around 155 million years ago, while Tyrannosaurus rex appears much later, around 66 million years ago. The distance between them exceeds the span separating the latter from the present. This separation highlights the depth of time within which these forms existed, each belonging to a different phase of a long and continuous sequence. In motion, Stegosaurus presents a form that remains close to the ground, its body carried on sturdy limbs that support a deliberate pace. It moves without haste, guided by the availability of vegetation that grows at low levels. Its head remains near the surface, gathering plant material from ferns and cycad fronds, its feeding continuous rather than hurried. As it moves, its plates may shift in tone, subtle changes in circulation altering their appearance in response to internal and external conditions. The overall presence of this animal is defined not by speed or aggression, but by structure and adaptation. Each element of its form contributes to a way of life that fits within its environment, balancing the need for energy, protection, and regulation. What remains is a figure that is both familiar and more complex than it first appears, shaped by functions that extend beyond the initial impressions it leaves behind. Land breaks apart here into fragments, not in a single dramatic divide, but into a scattering of low forms separated by water that threads between them. What will one day become a continuous continent exists instead as an archipelago, a chain of islands set within a broad, warm sea. The Tethys surrounds and connects these pieces, its surface extending across regions that later rise into mountains and plains. These islands vary in size, some little more than elevated stretches of ground, others supporting wider areas of vegetation. Their edges meet the sea gradually, with shallow margins that allow water to extend far inland during certain conditions. Between them lie lagoons, enclosed or semi-enclosed bodies of water that shift in character depending on their connection to the open sea. In what is now Bavaria, one such environment takes shape in the Solnhofen lagoons. Here, conditions diverge from those of surrounding waters. The salinity becomes elevated, exceeding that of the open ocean, while the lower layers periodically lose oxygen. In these anoxic intervals, the usual processes that break down organic material are slowed or halted. Bodies that settle into these depths remain intact, their structures preserved with unusual clarity as fine sediments accumulate around them. Over time, This setting captures a record that extends beyond bones. Feathers, soft tissues, and delicate outlines are retained, fixed in place with a level of detail rarely seen elsewhere. Among these remains is Archaeopteryx, its form preserved with individual feathers visible, each filament traced in stone. Alongside it appear pterosaurs, their wings outlined in fine impressions, as well as small dinosaurs, fish, horseshoe crabs, and even jellyfish, their shapes held in patterns that reveal their original presence with remarkable precision. Life on these islands develops under constraints different from those of larger land masses. Resources are limited by the size of each island, and the isolation created by surrounding water shapes the forms that persist. Over generations, some species adjust to these conditions by reducing in size, a process known as island dwarfism. In this setting, smaller bodies require less energy, allowing populations to remain stable within restricted environments. One example of this pattern appears in Europasaurus, a sauropod that, despite belonging to a group known for immense size, reaches only around 6 meters in length. Its proportions reflect its lineage, yet its scale aligns with the limits of the island it inhabits. It moves through a landscape that cannot support the demands of larger forms, its existence shaped by the balance between available vegetation and the energy required to sustain it. Across this archipelago, movement occurs both over land and through water. Some animals remain confined to individual islands, while others traverse the shallow channels that separate them. The sea itself becomes a medium of connection, allowing dispersal while maintaining boundaries that encourage divergence. The visual impression of this region forms from these elements combined. Water reflects light in clear, pale tones, shifting with depth and distance. Islands rise gently from its surface, covered in vegetation that remains low and continuous. Along the margins, flying reptiles pass close to the water, their movement following the contours of the shoreline. At times, smaller herbivores wade between landforms, their paths crossing narrow stretches where the sea allows passage. Within this setting, preservation and isolation work together, capturing both the forms of life and the conditions that shape them. Holding a detailed record of a world divided into many small, connected parts, far from the broad plains and shifting rivers preserved elsewhere. Another record forms in a region that followed its own path through the same span of time. In what is now northeastern China, layers of fine sediment settled in quiet basins, capturing an ecosystem that developed under conditions distinct from those seen in other parts of the Jurassic. This collection of deposits, known as the Yanliao biota, holds a community shaped by different climates, different landscapes, and different pressures that guided the course of evolution along its own trajectory. Within these layers, the forms that appear do not mirror those found in distant regions. Instead, they reveal a separate arrangement of life, one where familiar lineages take on unexpected expressions. Guanlong moves through this world as an early member of the Tyrannosaur group, yet it does not carry the scale associated with its later descendants. At around 3 meters in length, it remains relatively small, its body balanced and agile. Along its head rises a crest, a structure that adds visual distinction, suggesting roles in display or recognition rather than in feeding or defense. Its proportions already hint at what will come much later, yet its presence belongs fully to this earlier time. Nearby, another form challenges conventional expectations of how dinosaurs interacted with the air. Yi-Q, a small member of a group known as Scansoriopterygids, carries wings, unlike those of birds or pterosaurs. Its flight surfaces are formed not by feathers alone, but by membranes stretched between elongated structures, supported by a rod-like extension from the wrist. This arrangement creates a gliding capability that allows movement between elevated points, passing through the air in a manner that does not rely on powered flight. Its design stands apart, representing an experiment in form that appears briefly and leaves little direct continuation. Feathers themselves appear in greater abundance within this environment. Onchiornis, another small dinosaur from these deposits, is preserved with remarkable detail, its covering extending across its body in patterns that can be reconstructed with unusual precision. The microscopic structures known as melanosomes remain intact within these fossils, allowing the original colors to be inferred. Its plumage includes contrasting black and white tones across its wings and body, with red-brown hues concentrated around the head. This level of detail brings a different dimension to the appearance of these animals, revealing that color and pattern were integral parts of their presence. Taken together, these findings indicate that feathered dinosaurs were not isolated occurrences within the Jurassic. They formed a diverse and widespread component of this ecosystem, with variations in structure and function that extend beyond a single model. Some used feathers for insulation, others for display, and still others for movement through the air, each adaptation reflecting a specific interaction with its surroundings. This diversity alters the broader impression of the Jurassic world. Rather than a landscape defined only by scale and uniform texture, it includes a layer of visual complexity shaped by color, pattern, and variation in form. Smaller and medium-sized dinosaurs carry coverings that shift in tone and arrangement, adding detail to a world that might otherwise appear more uniform from a distance. Within this separate setting, life unfolds along its own course, producing forms that expand the range of what is possible within the same period. The Yanliao biota does not replace other records, but stands alongside them, offering a view of the Jurassic that is richer and more varied than any single location can provide. Water does not follow a single path here. It spreads, divides, and reforms, never settling into the narrow channels that define many rivers and later landscapes. From above, its movement resembles a network of shifting lines, braided together across a wide expanse of land, each thread adjusting its course with subtle changes in flow and sediment. Without grasses to anchor the soil, the edges of these rivers remain loose and easily altered. Banks do not hold firm boundaries. Instead, they collapse, rebuild, and migrate, allowing water to carve new routes while abandoning others. Channels split into multiple streams, rejoining and separating again, forming a pattern that remains in constant motion. What appears as a single river from a distance reveals itself, on closer view, as a collection of shallow currents moving side by side across a broad floodplain. The surface of these waters reflects this structure. Rather than a single, continuous body, it forms wide sheets broken by exposed bars of sand and gravel. Depth varies across short distances, with some channels running deeper and others spreading thinly across the ground. During periods of increased flow, these divisions blur, merging into larger expanses that cover previously dry areas. As water recedes, the pattern reappears, reshaped but recognizable in its braided form. Within these systems, freshwater life occupies a range of niches. Lungfish move through slower sections, their ability to tolerate low oxygen, allowing them to persist where other species might not. Early turtles navigate between submerged areas and exposed surfaces, their forms already suited to both land and water. Crocodilians appear along the margins, their bodies adapted for ambush, remaining still for extended periods before sudden movement. Among them are forms such as Protosuchus, early representatives of a lineage that will continue with little fundamental change. Larger amphibians also inhabit these environments, their presence tied to the availability of water and the conditions it provides. These temnospondyls, with broad bodies and flattened heads, move through shallower regions, their lives connected to both aquatic and terrestrial spaces. Together, these groups create a community shaped by the structure of the river itself, each species occupying positions defined by depth, flow, and proximity to land. Lakes within this landscape offer a different kind of record. In their quieter waters, fine sediments settle in thin layers, accumulating year by year. These layers, known as varves, form alternating bands that reflect seasonal changes in material carried into the lake. Over time, they build a sequence that can be counted, each pair representing a single cycle. Through these deposits, it becomes possible to trace variations in climate across spans of time that extend far beyond immediate observation. Along the edges of these water bodies, the absence of certain plants creates a distinct visual boundary. There is no continuous cover of grass to soften the transition between land and water. Instead, the ground meets the river in exposed textures, gravel and sediment giving way to patches of low vegetation. The surface remains open, allowing a clear view across the channels as they shift and divide. At the margins, movement is minimal until it is not. A crocodilian rests near the edge, its form nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding surface until it alters position. Nearby, smaller disturbances mark the passage of other animals, their interactions brief and often unnoticed. Beyond the immediate reach of the water, larger forms move through the surrounding landscape, their presence indicated by subtle changes carried across distance. This arrangement forms a system that remains in motion, shaped continuously by the flow of water and the materials it carries, creating patterns that evolve without ever fully settling into a fixed form. Air carries more than movement and sound. It holds traces of chemistry that pass unnoticed until they gather into something distinct, a presence that cannot be seen, yet shapes every moment of being within it. In this world, scent forms a continuous layer, drifting through open spaces and settling close to the ground, rising and fading with subtle shifts in temperature and light. Although it leaves no direct imprint in stone, this dimension can be approached through what is known of the organisms that produced it. Plants release compounds into the air as part of their normal function, and among the dominant trees here, conifers play a central role. Their tissues produce terpenes, molecules that evaporate readily and disperse through the atmosphere. These compounds create a sharp, resinous character, similar in nature to the scent found in modern pine forests, though likely more pervasive in a world where such trees are widespread and continuous. Interwoven with this is the presence of cycads, whose reproductive processes involve a different set of signals. Their pollen does not pass unnoticed through the air. It carries a strong, often heated quality, a pungent release that attracts insects responsible for transferring it between plants. Some modern cycads produce this effect through a rise in temperature within their cones, intensifying the emission of scent. In this earlier world, such signals would have been widespread, forming pockets of concentrated odor that marked specific locations within the landscape. Beneath these living layers, another process unfolds more slowly. The breakdown of plant material proceeds without the full network of organisms that will later accelerate it. Angiosperms have not yet appeared, and the fungal systems associated with them are less developed. As a result, fallen wood and other organic matter remain intact for longer periods, accumulating and gradually changing over time. This creates a persistent bass note in the air, a deep, organic presence that does not dissipate quickly but lingers, shaped by the steady transformation of material back into soil. Animal life contributes its own additions to this mixture. Large herbivores move through the environment, their bodies producing scents tied to their metabolism and interaction with the surrounding plants. These traces do not spread evenly, but remain localized, marking the passage or presence of individuals within certain areas. Combined with the moisture of the ground, these elements blend into a broader atmosphere that shifts depending on proximity and movement. Rain alters this composition further. When water falls onto exposed soil, it releases compounds stored within the surface, producing a distinct scent that rises briefly before dispersing. In a landscape where precipitation occurs regularly, this effect repeats often, adding a cyclical element to the overall pattern. The ground itself becomes a source of scent, not only when disturbed, but as part of an ongoing exchange between surface and air. Where conifer trunks are damaged, another element appears. Resin flows from these openings, carrying with it a concentrated version of the compounds already present in the tree. Freshly exposed, this material releases a sharper, almost medicinal character, distinct from the broader forest background. Over time, this resin may harden and eventually become amber, preserving fragments of the world within it, but in its initial state, it remains an active source of scent. Together, these components form a layered sensory environment, one that surrounds every organism continuously. It is not static, but shifts with movement, with changes in moisture, and with the cycles of growth and decay. The air becomes a medium not only for breath, but for information, carrying signals that connect different parts of the ecosystem into a shared and ever-changing presence. Motion leaves a record that endures longer than the body itself. Long after bone has shifted and broken, the ground can retain the imprint of a step, preserving the direction, spacing, and rhythm of movement across a surface that once yielded under weight. In these traces, patterns emerge that reshape how these animals are understood. Earlier interpretations imagine them as heavy and unbalanced, their bodies dragging across the ground, their movement slow and uncertain. This image arose before the evidence of trackways and structural analysis became clear. The impressions preserved in ancient sediments tell a different story, one of balance, coordination, and controlled motion. Large theropods moved with their bodies aligned forward, their posture held close to horizontal. Their tails did not trail behind them as inert extensions. Instead, they remained elevated, acting as counterbalances that stabilized the body during each step. This arrangement shifts the center of mass toward the hips, allowing the legs to support weight efficiently, while the upper body remains steady. The resulting gait is not erratic or unstable, but deliberate, each stride placed with precision. The spacing between footprints reveals further detail. Steps follow a consistent pattern, indicating a pace that can be maintained over long distances. Biomechanical studies suggest that animals such as Allosaurus could sustain speeds between 8 and 14 kilometers per hour while walking. This is not a brief burst of motion, but a continuous progression, allowing them to traverse large areas without interruption. Movement becomes a process of covering ground steadily rather than accelerating and stopping in short intervals. Among the largest herbivores, similar evidence appears. Sauropod trackways rarely include marks from tails contacting the ground. Their long tails were carried horizontally, serving as dynamic extensions that contributed to balance during locomotion. Each step produced a deep impression yet the absence of drag marks indicates a level of control that keeps the body elevated and aligned. Their movement, though slower in pace, maintains a consistent rhythm that allows them to travel together across the landscape. Stegosaurus presents another variation. Its trackways show a wide stance, the feet placed in a pattern that supports a low center of gravity. This arrangement provides stability, allowing it to move across uneven terrain without losing balance. Its pace remains measured, each step contributing to a steady progression rather than abrupt shifts in speed. The impression is not of heaviness, but of careful placement, guided by the structure of its body. Across the broader landscape, these patterns combine into a continuous flow of movement. Animals move along paths shaped by terrain, by the distribution of resources, and by interactions with one another. Their motion reflects the requirements of their bodies, each species following a form that aligns with its structure and role within the environment. The ground records these movements as sequences of impressions, each one connected to the next, forming lines that extend across time. From these lines, a clearer image emerges, one that replaces earlier assumptions with a view grounded in direct evidence. Dinosaurs do not move as unbalanced forms, struggling against their own weight. They move with purpose, their bodies arranged in ways that support efficiency and endurance. This understanding reshapes the way their presence is perceived. Movement becomes an expression of design, each step to a result of structure refined through long processes, allowing these animals to navigate their world with consistency and control. Patterns appear when traces are viewed together, small pieces aligning into something more continuous than any single fragment can suggest. Bone, track, and imprint carry not only form, but repetition, and from repetition comes a sense of behavior that extends beyond isolated moments. Among the clearest of these patterns is the arrangement of eggs. In several sites, clusters attributed to theropods are not scattered without order, but placed with consistency, each egg positioned in relation to the others. The spacing suggests intent, a structure that reflects more than simple deposition. These nests indicate a degree of attention, a process in which placement matters, where the survival of what develops inside is shaped by how and where it is laid. This tendency extends across larger scales in other groups. Evidence from nesting grounds, including those found at Aucamahuevo in what is now Argentina, shows repeated use of the same locations over time. Although these sites belong to a slightly later period, the continuity of the lineage suggests that similar behavior reaches back into earlier stages. Individuals return to the same areas, generation after generation, guided by conditions that support development. The ground itself becomes part of the reproductive cycle, a place that holds significance beyond a single season. Movement across the land reveals another layer of interaction. Trackways preserve sequences of footprints that align in parallel, extending over distances that indicate coordinated travel. Within these patterns, differences in size appear, showing that individuals at various stages of growth move together. Larger and smaller bodies follow similar paths, maintaining proximity as they progress. This arrangement reflects more than coincidence, suggesting a form of grouping where individuals remain connected as they move through the environment. Growth itself leaves a record within the structure of bone. Layers form as tissue is added over time, creating rings that can be examined in much the same way as those found in trees. These growth rings show that young individuals developed rapidly, reaching substantial size within relatively short periods. This rate differs from the slower patterns associated with many modern reptiles, aligning more closely with the growth seen in birds and mammals. Such a pace requires sustained energy intake and a physiology capable of supporting it. At a smaller scale, additional interactions become visible. Fossils preserve evidence of organisms that lived on or within these animals, including parasites similar in form to modern botflies and lice. Their presence indicates relationships that operate below the level of direct observation, affecting individuals without altering their overall structure in obvious ways. These interactions add complexity to the ecosystem, showing that even the smallest organisms played a role in shaping the lives of larger ones. Taken together, these traces form a picture of continuity. Dinosaurs did not exist as isolated bodies, moving through space without connection. They participated in cycles that included birth, growth, movement, and eventual decline. They returned to specific places, maintained proximity to others, and supported the development of their young through structured behavior. What emerges is not a series of disconnected actions, but a set of life histories that unfold over time. Each individual passes through stages, interacting with its environment and with others in ways that leave subtle but lasting records. These patterns, preserved across different forms of evidence, reveal a world where behavior follows structure and where structure reflects the ongoing processes that define life itself. At a smaller scale, life arranges itself in ways that rarely draw attention from a distance, yet shape nearly every process that unfolds across the surface. Between stems, within shallow water, and across the thin layers of air closest to the ground, insects move continuously, forming a network of activity that connects plants, soil, and larger animals. The composition of this community differs from what is familiar today. There are no bees moving between blossoms, no butterflies tracing patterns across open spaces, and no ants forming lines that cross the ground in organized paths. These groups have not yet taken their place within the system. Instead, other lineages occupy the roles that will later be reshaped by their arrival. Among them are large aquatic insects, their bodies adapted for movement through still or slow water. Some resemble modern water bugs in general form, though often larger, their presence marking the surfaces of ponds and channels where they hunt or feed. In the air, relatives of dragonflies move with controlled flight, their wings structured to maintain stability as they travel across short distances or hover above open areas. Beetles appear in a variety of forms, their hardened wing cases protecting the structures beneath, allowing them to navigate through vegetation and across surfaces with resilience. Flies are present as well, occupying roles that include feeding on organic material and interacting with plant structures. Primitive moths move quietly within this system, their presence less visible but still integral to the broader pattern of life. Pollination, in the absence of flowers, follows pathways that differ from those seen in later ecosystems. Mecoptera, commonly referred to as scorpion flies, take on a central role. They are drawn to substances produced by gymnosperms, including droplets of resin and other secretions that provide both nutrition and opportunity for transfer of pollen. Their interactions with these plants form a direct exchange, guided by chemical cues rather than visual signals. Some of the most detailed records of these insects come from amber, formed when resin hardens and preserves what it encloses. Although deposits from this period are less abundant than those from later times, they still provide remarkable detail. Within these translucent structures, fine features remain intact, including individual hairs, the branching patterns of wings, and the shapes of mouthparts. These details allow a closer understanding of how these insects interacted with their environment, revealing aspects of their behavior that cannot be seen in larger fossil forms. Toward the later part of this period, another development begins to appear. Early forms of social insects emerge, represented by primitive wasps that show indications of group living. These initial steps toward organized colonies suggest a shift in behavior, where individuals begin to coordinate their activities in ways that extend beyond solitary existence. The absence of ants remains a significant difference in this system. In later ecosystems, ants play a major role in moving soil, distributing seeds, and influencing the structure of the ground itself. Without them, the processes that shape the soil operate through different mechanisms. Other organisms contribute to these changes, but the scale and pattern differ, resulting in a system that functions without one of the dominant forces seen in more recent times. This community of insects, though small in size, forms a continuous presence that supports and connects larger patterns of life. Their movements, interactions, and adaptations contribute to the functioning of the ecosystem, shaping processes that extend far beyond their individual scale. Underfoot, the surface does not hold in the way a later world will come to expect. It yields slightly, then settles, responding to weight with a softness that absorbs each step rather than resisting it. The ground here is not tightly bound, its structure shaped by materials that accumulate and shift without the deep anchoring systems that will one day stabilize it. Without grasses and flowering plants, there are no dense root networks to hold soil firmly in place. The upper layers remain loose, composed of fine particles and organic matter that can be displaced by water or movement. Rain alters this surface quickly, carrying sediment across short distances, reshaping contours that do not remain fixed for long. Erosion occurs not as a rare event, but as a continual process, adjusting the ground in subtle, ongoing ways. Beneath this shifting layer, a quieter system connects the living elements of the landscape. Fungal networks extend through the soil, linking the roots of conifers and other plants into a shared exchange. These mycorrhizal connections move nutrients and signals between organisms, forming an underground structure that supports growth and resilience. Though composed of different species than those found later, the principle remains the same: a web of interactions operating below the surface, unseen but constant. Above these networks, the ground is covered by a thick accumulation of fallen material. Needles from conifers and fronds from cycads settle in layers, building over time into a dense mat. This layer does not break down quickly. Decomposition proceeds at a slower pace, allowing organic matter to persist and deepen. The result is a surface that feels springy, each step compressing the accumulated layers before they return to their original form. Across this terrain, larger movements leave more pronounced marks. When sauropods pass, their weight presses deeply into the soft ground, forming impressions that extend well below the surface. These footprints remain long after the animals have moved on, their depth and shape reflecting the force applied at each step. In some cases, these depressions collect water, forming small, temporary pools that persist until conditions change. Such features create localized environments where smaller organisms gather, using them as brief sources of water and habitat. Below this visible layer, another world extends through the soil. Burrowing animals create networks of tunnels and chambers, shaping spaces that provide shelter and access to resources. Early mammals move through these passages, their bodies adapted to navigate confined spaces. Lizards and invertebrates also contribute to this structure, their activity altering the composition and arrangement of the soil from within. These subterranean pathways form a hidden system that mirrors the complexity above, allowing life to persist in multiple dimensions. Walking across this ground involves a continuous interaction with these layers. Each step meets resistance that is not rigid, but responsive, adjusting under pressure and then returning to form. The surface is uneven, shaped by the accumulation of organic material and the impressions left by larger animals. In places, circular depressions filled with standing water interrupt the continuity, their edges defined by the weight that created them. This environment does not present a fixed or uniform surface. It shifts with time, with movement, and with the processes that operate both above and below. The ground becomes an active component of the ecosystem, not simply a base upon which life stands, but a medium that records, supports, and responds to everything that moves across it. At the farthest reaches of the planet, where light itself changes its rhythm, the land does not fall silent or freeze into stillness. Instead, it remains active, covered in growth that continues through cycles of illumination and absence, shaped by a pattern of time that unfolds differently from lower latitudes. In these regions, forests extend across ground that will one day lie beneath ice. Paleobotanical evidence drawn from Antarctica and the Arctic reveals dense communities of conifers and ferns, their remains preserved in sediments that once supported continuous vegetation. These are not sparse or stunted growths, but established ecosystems with layers of plant life arranged across terrain that receives light and darkness in long, uninterrupted intervals. The cycle of the year follows a pattern defined by the tilt of the planet. For extended periods, the sun remains above the horizon, casting continuous light across the landscape. During these months, growth accelerates, driven by the sustained availability of energy. Plants extend upward and outward, adding new layers to their structure without the interruption of night. This phase is followed by an equally extended period of darkness, where the sun does not rise and the land enters a different state, one not of cold, but of reduced activity. Temperature remains moderate despite these changes in light. Without the formation of ice caps, the poles do not experience the extremes that define them in later times. The environment supports liquid water, with rivers and lakes present across the terrain, maintaining conditions suitable for life throughout the year. The absence of freezing allows ecosystems to persist without the need for complete dormancy, even during the darker months. Animals living in these regions adapt to this unique cycle. Some evidence suggests movement across distances, with certain species potentially shifting their range in response to changing conditions. Others appear to remain in place, adjusting their behavior to the periods of darkness. Activity patterns shift, feeding and movement aligning with the availability of resources rather than with a daily cycle of light and night. The structure of the vegetation reflects these conditions. Trees grow to considerable size, their trunks recording the passage of time in rings that form within the wood. These growth rings reveal a pattern of rapid expansion during periods of continuous light, followed by slower development during darker intervals. The contrast between these phases creates distinct layers within the wood, each representing a cycle shaped by the unique rhythm of the poles. The landscape itself supports a range of life that operates within these constraints. Rivers move through the terrain, connecting lakes and low-lying areas, while the forests provide structure and shelter. The absence of ice allows these systems to function continuously, with water flowing and vegetation maintaining its presence across the surface. This view of the poles alters the broader understanding of the Jurassic world. It shows that the conditions supporting life are not limited to regions closer to the equator, but extend across the entire planet. The same processes that shape ecosystems in other areas are present here as well, adapted to a different pattern of light but sustained by the same underlying factors. The result is a global system, one in which warmth and growth reach every latitude, creating a continuity that links distant regions into a single, interconnected world. There is no single moment when the world pauses and changes its name. The passage from one span of deep time into another unfolds without announcement, carried forward by the same winds, the same waters, the same quiet persistence of living things, adjusting to shifts that arrive too slowly to be seen all at once. Around 145 million years ago, the interval known as the Jurassic gives way to what will later be called the Cretaceous. This boundary does not carry the sharp edge of catastrophe seen in other transitions. There is no sudden clearing of life across the planet, no single event that draws a clear line. Instead, the change settles in gradually, layer by layer, recorded in sediments that show alteration rather than interruption. The evidence for this transition is subtle and uneven. In some regions, fossil records reveal a thinning of familiar species, a quiet reduction that suggests elevated extinction rates. In others, continuity remains strong, with ecosystems shifting composition rather than collapsing. The causes behind these changes do not resolve into a single explanation. Multiple forces appear to move together, shaping conditions in ways that overlap and reinforce one another. One of the most visible changes lies in the movement of the oceans. Sea levels begin to fall, drawing back from continental interiors and exposing land that had long been submerged. Shallow marine environments, once widespread and stable, contract and fragment. Coastlines shift outward, and with them the habitats that depend on the meeting of land and water. The retreat of these seas alters currents, nutrient flows, and the distribution of life across broad regions. At the same time, volcanic activity increases in certain parts of the world. In what is now the Sichuan Basin of China, extensive eruptions release gases into the atmosphere, adding to a background of environmental variability. These emissions interact with existing climate systems, introducing fluctuations that ripple outward through ecosystems. The changes are not abrupt, but they accumulate, adjusting temperature, chemistry, and the balance of conditions that species depend upon. Within this shifting framework, many of the animals that defined earlier landscapes begin to disappear. Large herbivores, such as Brachiosaurus, no longer appear in younger deposits. Predators like Allosaurus fade from the record, along with forms such as Stegosaurus that had occupied their own distinct ecological roles. Their absence does not leave empty space for long. Other lineages, already present, expand into these changing environments, adapting to the new distribution of resources and conditions. Some groups persist across the boundary, carrying forward traits that will continue to evolve. Their continuity forms a bridge between the two periods, linking what came before with what will follow. The world does not reset. It reorganizes, retaining elements of its earlier structure while allowing new patterns to emerge. The transition itself remains difficult to define with precision. Geological layers do not always align cleanly across continents, and the signals they contain vary in clarity. This uncertainty reflects the nature of the change, which unfolds over spans of time that blur the edges of classification. The boundary exists because it is useful to mark it, not because it was experienced as a sudden shift by the living world. As this passage completes, the planet carries forward the accumulated outcomes of millions of years. Landscapes continue to form and reform, climates adjust within their new ranges, and life proceeds without pause. The Cretaceous begins not as a break, but as a continuation shaped by what the Jurassic has already set in motion. In certain quiet corners of the present, time folds gently back on itself. A leaf falls, a shell drifts, a shape moves through water or rests in stillness, and within it is a continuity that does not announce its age, yet carries it without interruption. Among these survivors stands a tree whose lineage reaches deep into that earlier world. The fan-shaped leaves of Ginkgo biloba move in familiar patterns when stirred by air, their veins spreading outward like delicate threads from a single point. This structure has endured with almost no alteration across 170 million years. The trees that stand today are not replicas or echoes. They are the same design, sustained through cycles of change that passed around them without breaking their form. Elsewhere, along shorelines and in deeper waters, other ancient lineages continue their quiet persistence. Horseshoe crabs move across tidal flats with a steady, deliberate motion, their bodies protected by curved shells that have remained recognizable across vast stretches of time. Nautiluses drift through the ocean with coiled chambers that regulate their depth, a living geometry that mirrors fossils found in stone. Crocodilians rest at the edges of water, their bodies low and composed, their presence defined by stillness punctuated by sudden precision. On isolated islands, tuataras remain, carrying features that once belonged to a broader group, now largely gone, their slow movements marking a rhythm that has changed little. In the air, the continuation takes a different form. Every bird that crosses the sky belongs to a lineage that traces directly back through theropod ancestors. Feathers, bones, and motion have shifted over time, refined and reshaped, yet the connection remains unbroken. The transformation did not erase what came before. It carried it forward, altering its expression while preserving its origin. Some survivals are not visible in shape alone, but in sensation. The sharp, resinous character of a pine forest comes from terpenes, compounds that have circulated through conifer tissues for immense spans of time. When this scent rises in warm air, it carries with it a chemical continuity that links present landscapes to those far older ones. The molecules themselves follow pathways that have remained stable, moving through cycles of growth, release, and decay without losing their identity. Sound, too, preserves its own continuity. The low, resonant call of a crocodilian moves through air and water with a depth that reflects an ancient architecture of vocalization. The structure that produces it has endured, allowing the same tonal qualities to persist across millions of years. When that sound carries over still water, it does so with a familiarity that extends far beyond the moment in which it is heard. These survivals are not rare anomalies. They are fragments of a broader continuity that threads through the living world. Each persists because it remained compatible with changing conditions, adjusting where necessary, holding steady where possible. Evolution did not require constant transformation. In some cases, stability itself proved sufficient. What remains from that earlier time is therefore not confined to stone or memory. It exists in living systems that continue to function, to grow, to move, and to reproduce. The present world contains these inheritances not as distant relics, but as active participants in ongoing ecological processes. Within them, the Jurassic persists, not as a place revisited, but as a condition that never fully departed. Knowledge of a vanished world does not arrive fully formed. It is assembled from fragments that appear, at first, incomplete and silent, each one holding a portion of a larger pattern that only becomes visible when placed in relation to others. What remains of that distant time is not memory, but material. Bone, mineral, and impression carry within them traces of processes that once moved through living bodies. Paleontology draws these traces outward, not through speculation, but through methods grounded in chemistry, physics, and geometry. The rock does not simply contain shapes. It contains information, structured and preserved in ways that can be measured, compared, and understood. Within fossilized bone, isotopes remain as quiet signatures of ancient conditions. Variations in these isotopes reflect the temperatures at which tissues formed, allowing reconstruction of internal body heat. Patterns of growth become visible in microscopic layers, revealing how quickly an animal matured, how its development changed over time, and whether its life followed steady rhythms or periods of rapid expansion. In some cases, these chemical signals extend beyond the individual, suggesting movement across landscapes as different environmental signatures appear along the length of a single bone. Other techniques move inward without altering what they examine. Synchrotron scanning directs intense beams of light through fossils, tracing internal structures with extraordinary precision. The resulting images reveal cavities where brains once rested, channels that carried nerves, and delicate formations within the inner ear that relate to balance and orientation. Even within fossilized eggs, embryonic forms can be seen, preserved in positions that record stages of development long before hatching. Color, once thought permanently lost, can now be approached through structures smaller than the wavelength of visible light. Melanosomes, microscopic bodies responsible for pigmentation, retain their shapes even after the surrounding tissues have transformed. By comparing these shapes to those found in modern organisms, it becomes possible to infer patterns of color with increasing confidence. Bands, gradients, and contrasts emerge, offering glimpses of surfaces that once interacted with light in specific ways. Movement, which leaves no direct imprint in bone, appears instead in the ground itself. Tracks preserved in sediment record sequences of motion, each step captured as a moment of contact between body and surface. The spacing, depth, and orientation of these tracks reveal speed, posture, and the distribution of weight. From a series of impressions, it becomes possible to reconstruct not just how an animal stood, but how it moved through space, whether it traveled alone or alongside others, whether it carried additional mass or shifted direction. These methods do not operate in isolation. Each contributes a layer to an expanding structure of understanding, where physical evidence is interpreted through consistent principles. As new techniques emerge, they do not simply confirm earlier ideas, they refine them, sometimes altering the picture in ways that require earlier assumptions to be set aside. The image of that world has changed repeatedly as a result. Reconstructions that once appeared stable have been reshaped, not through imagination, but through the accumulation of detail that reveals complexity where simplicity was once assumed. The Jurassic understood today differs profoundly from the one envisioned decades ago, not because the past has changed, but because the means of reading it have become more precise. In this ongoing process, certainty remains provisional, anchored to evidence that can always be examined again, measured again, and placed within a broader context as new discoveries emerge. Long before the landscapes themselves could be understood, the name arrived first, a quiet label placed upon layers of stone. In the year 1829, the geologist Alexandre Brongniart drew that name from the Jura Mountains, giving a fragment of Earth's history a word that could be spoken, repeated, and carried forward into human thought. At that time, the idea of deep time was only beginning to take shape. Fossil bones, once seen as curiosities or remnants of unknown creatures, began to settle into a broader framework. By the 1820s, the first remains of animals from this period had been described in scientific terms, their forms studied with increasing care. Within a generation, this emerging understanding spread beyond laboratories and into public life. Victorian society found itself drawn toward these distant worlds, not as abstractions, but as places that had once existed with their own internal coherence. The desire to see that world led to one of the earliest attempts to make it visible. In 1854, in London's Crystal Palace Park, large sculpted figures were installed among the trees and pathways. These were the first life-sized reconstructions of ancient animals ever created. Their shapes, informed by the limited knowledge of the time, carried inaccuracies in posture, proportion, and detail. Yet they represented something more important than precision. They marked the moment when the past was no longer confined to stone and text, but placed into shared space, where people could walk among interpretations of creatures that had lived millions of years before. As knowledge expanded, so too did the ways in which this period was imagined. Books, illustrations, and later films began to shape a collective picture. In 1993, the release of Jurassic Park brought that picture into a new form, combining scientific ideas with cinematic language. The result was a vivid, immediate vision that reached across cultures and settled into global awareness. The movements, sounds, and environments presented there became familiar, forming a kind of visual shorthand for an entire era. Yet this shared image did not remain fixed. Scientific understanding continued to evolve, revealing details that differed from earlier portrayals. New discoveries refined posture, behavior, and appearance, often in ways that contrasted with what had become widely accepted. The gap between what is popularly imagined and what is supported by evidence grew wider, not through error alone, but through the natural pace at which knowledge advances compared to the persistence of familiar images. This difference does not diminish the value of those earlier interpretations. Each stage of understanding reflects the tools and information available at the time. What changes is the scale of detail, the resolution at which the past can be seen. As methods improve and evidence accumulates, the picture becomes more intricate, less constrained by assumption, and more closely aligned with the processes that shaped it. What remains constant is the impulse to imagine. The effort to reconstruct that distant world is not separate from the scientific work that supports it. Both arise from the same curiosity, the same recognition that the present is part of a longer continuity that extends beyond direct experience. In this sense, each new reconstruction does not replace what came before. It extends it, adding depth and precision, allowing the imagined world to move closer to the one that once existed. Numbers can stretch beyond the reach of intuition, becoming symbols rather than experiences. 150 million years belongs to that category, a span so large that it resists being held in a single thought. To approach it, the mind builds scaffolding, reducing scale until something graspable begins to form. Imagine the entire history of Earth compressed into a single calendar year. The earliest days of January hold the formation of oceans and the first traces of life. Through long, quiet months, simple organisms persist and diversify. By the time the calendar reaches mid-November, the interval known as the Jurassic unfolds, occupying only a few days within this constructed year. Its duration, immense in absolute terms, becomes brief when set against the full expanse that surrounds it. Near the very end of December, the scale contracts again, The span of human civilization, from the earliest cities in Mesopotamia to the present moment, fits within the final seconds before midnight. Everything associated with recorded history, every structure raised, every system developed, every story preserved in writing, occurs within that narrow margin. Against the broader timeline, it appears almost instantaneous. This compression reveals how unevenly time is distributed across experience. Periods that seem vast when considered alone become brief when placed within a larger frame. The Jurassic, despite its length, passes quickly in this comparison, while human history becomes a flicker that the wider sequence would not register as a distinct interval. Yet within that span, life did not unfold as an abstraction. Each day carried its own conditions, shaped by weather, light, and the interactions of living systems. Individual organisms moved through their environments with the same immediacy that characterizes life now. They fed, rested, encountered others of their kind, and responded to the pressures of their surroundings. Their existence was not defined by the scale of geological time, but by the immediate sequence of moments that composed their lives. The difficulty arises from the contrast between these perspectives. From a distance, time becomes a smooth continuum, its divisions imposed for the sake of understanding. Up close, it resolves into discrete events, each one specific and unrepeatable. The same interval can appear both immense and intimate, depending on the scale at which it is viewed. To hold both perspectives at once requires a shift in attention. The mind moves between the broad sweep and the individual instance, recognizing that neither alone captures the full character of what occurred. The Jurassic was not simply a segment within a larger sequence. It was a continuous succession of lived moments, each one embedded within the wider flow of time. This duality does not diminish the significance of any single moment. Instead, it places each within a structure that extends far beyond immediate perception. The persistence of life across such spans reflects a continuity that is not defined by any one era, but by the ongoing process that connects them. In this way, the weight of deep time becomes less about scale alone and more about the accumulation of specific events, each contributing to a sequence that remains unbroken. A single lineage, traced without interruption, can extend farther than any landscape or climate that once surrounded it. Across spans that exceed imagination, life has continued, not as a fixed form, but as an ongoing process that reshapes itself while remaining unbroken. For approximately 3.8 billion years, this process has persisted on Earth. The interval described as the Jurassic occupies only a small portion within that immense duration. Before it, countless generations of simpler organisms lived and divided, forming the biochemical foundations upon which later complexity would emerge. Early animals appeared, diversified, and in many cases disappeared, leaving behind patterns that would be taken up again in altered forms. Extinction events punctuated this long history, removing large portions of life and opening pathways for new configurations to arise. The beginning of the Jurassic follows one such moment of loss. A large proportion of species had already vanished, leaving ecosystems reduced and restructured. What followed was not a return to what had existed before, but a period of expansion built from what remained. Over tens of millions of years, life diversified into new roles, filling spaces that had been cleared and establishing relationships that had not previously existed. This pattern repeats throughout the broader history of life. After each reduction, there is an expansion, a phase during which variation increases and new forms appear. These radiations are not directed toward a predetermined outcome. They explore possibilities within the constraints of environment and inheritance, producing combinations that could not have been anticipated from earlier states. Some of these persist, others vanish, but the process itself continues without interruption. The large animals that once moved across Jurassic landscapes no longer exist in their original forms. Their structures, behaviors, and ecological roles have been replaced or transformed. Yet the principles that produce them remain active. Variation continues to arise within populations. Selection continues to shape which variations persist. Adaptation continues to align organisms with their surroundings. Time continues to accumulate these changes, extending the sequence forward. The connection between that distant world and the present is not symbolic, it is biological. The small mammals that occupied marginal niches during that period carried within them lineages that would extend through successive generations. Each generation inherited traits, modified them, and passed them onward. Through this continuous chain, those early forms are linked directly to later ones, including those that exist now. This continuity means that the present is not separate from what came before. It is the current expression of a process that has never ceased. The environments have changed, the dominant forms have shifted, but the underlying mechanisms remain consistent. Life persists by adapting to conditions as they arise, maintaining continuity even as its outward appearance transforms. The longevity of this process suggests a stability that does not depend on any single form or environment. It is not tied to specific species or particular arrangements of ecosystems. Instead, it is rooted in the capacity of living systems to generate variation and to respond to changing conditions in ways that allow continuity to be maintained. In this sense, survival across such spans is not defined by endurance alone. It reflects an ongoing capacity for change that ensures persistence without requiring constancy. Between events that leave marks in stone, there are stretches of time that pass without record, composed of ordinary actions repeated until they become the fabric of existence. These intervals do not announce themselves, yet they occupy most of what life is. Across that long span, countless days unfolded without conflict or change large enough to be preserved. A large herbivore stands in water that reaches just high enough to cool its body. Its posture settles into stillness, weight distributed through limbs that hold without strain. The surface around it shifts gently, disturbed only by small movements that ripple outward and fade. It remains there, not from urgency, but from a balance reached between body and environment, a state maintained for as long as conditions allow. Elsewhere, beneath the surface of the ground, a smaller life waits within a narrow space shaped by its own movement. The walls of that space hold the warmth of the surrounding earth. Above, the cycle of light progresses without immediate consequence. Within, there is only the slow passage of time marked by internal rhythms, a pause before activity begins again under different conditions. This pattern repeats across generations, each one following the same sequence without awareness of its duration. The beginning of a day arrives gradually. Light moves through layered vegetation, filtered and softened as it passes through overlapping forms. The intensity shifts, not abruptly, but through a steady increase that alters the visibility of surfaces and edges. Shadows shorten and change direction, defining the structure of the environment in subtle ways. These transitions occur whether or not they are observed, forming a continuous background to all activity. Weather moves through these landscapes with its own quiet persistence. Moisture gathers, suspended in the air until it condenses and falls. The first contact with surfaces produces a sequence of sounds that vary with texture and density. Drops strike, merge, and run, creating patterns that shift as intensity changes. The process continues until the source diminishes, leaving behind a surface altered in ways that will influence what follows. Most of what occurs within such a world does not lead to immediate consequence. Feeding, resting, moving short distances, remaining still, these actions compose the majority of lived experience. They are repeated not because they are significant in isolation, but because they sustain the conditions under which life continues. Over immense spans, these repetitions accumulate, forming the continuity that underlies more visible changes. To consider these moments is to recognize that life is not defined solely by its extremes. The intervals between them carry equal weight, though they leave fewer traces. They are the conditions within which all other events take place, providing the continuity that allows patterns to persist. In that distant time, each of these moments existed without reference to what would come later. They were complete in themselves, shaped by immediate conditions rather than by any broader narrative. The world functioned through these repetitions, maintaining its processes through countless instances of ordinary activity. What remains of that period is often drawn from what was exceptional, yet the greater portion lies in what was consistent. The accumulation of these quiet moments forms a continuity that extends beyond any single event, carrying life forward through time without interruption. Beneath the surfaces we walk on, within the walls that surround us, and even in the air that fills our lungs, there are layers of time held quietly in place, carrying forward the work of worlds that no longer exist in their original form. Far below the present landscape, organic remains settled into ancient seabeds, pressed and altered over immense spans until their chemistry transformed. The drifting bodies of microscopic life, once suspended in warm oceans, became part of a slow accumulation that deepened and compacted. Heat and pressure rearranged their structure, turning soft matter into dense reservoirs of energy. When released, that stored sunlight returns in another form, driving movement, shaping cities, sustaining systems that appear entirely modern while depending on processes that began long before them. In other regions, the remains of marine organisms built something more solid. Shells settled in layers, each one contributing to a growing mass that hardened over time. These deposits rose with shifting land, becoming stone that could be cut, shaped, and assembled. Structures built from these materials carry within them the record of an ocean that once covered those same areas. The pale surfaces of carved walls and columns hold the compressed remains of organisms that lived and died in shallow seas, their forms dissolved into a continuous mineral fabric. On land, forests that no longer stand contributed in a different way. Plant matter gathered, buried before it could fully decay, preserved in conditions that prevented its complete return to the atmosphere. Over long intervals, these layers changed, concentrating the energy captured from ancient light. What remains is a dense, dark substance that can be ignited, releasing heat that once passed through leaves and stems. The process connects present warmth to growth that occurred under skies separated from this moment by vast distances in time. The air itself carries continuity from those same intervals. Oxygen accumulates through countless acts of photosynthesis, each one adding a small contribution to a larger whole. Forests of earlier ages participated in this balance, exchanging gases in cycles that continue without interruption. Every inhalation draws from an atmosphere shaped through repetition, maintained by processes that have persisted across eras without pause. Nothing in the present stands entirely apart from what preceded it. Materials, energy, and conditions arrive already formed by earlier systems, inherited rather than newly created. The ground, the air, and the resources drawn from them are part of a continuous chain that extends backward beyond immediate perception. To consider this is to recognize that the present world is assembled from accumulated layers of activity, each one dependent on what came before. The structures that support daily life are not only built by recent effort, but by processes that unfolded across deep time, preparing conditions that would later be used in ways not anticipated by those earlier systems. What remains from that distant interval is not limited to fossils or isolated traces. It persists as part of the framework that allows the current world to function. Energy, material, and atmosphere all carry forward the influence of those earlier environments, integrated into systems that continue to operate. In this sense, that period is not separate from the present. It exists within it, embedded in the substances and processes that sustain ongoing activity. The continuity is quiet, but it is constant, a foundation that remains in place beneath everything that follows. A thin slab of pale stone rests in quiet stillness, its surface carrying a delicate impression that has outlasted everything around it. Pressed into that limestone is the trace of a feather, each filament etched with such precision that it seems almost recent, as though it might lift if touched. It belonged to a single body, at a single moment, on a day that passed without ceremony. The animal moved, the feather fell or brushed against soft sediment, and the mark remained, held in place as layers gathered above it and time moved forward without interruption. That imprint does not announce itself as extraordinary. It does not carry noise or motion. It simply exists, a record of contact between life and surface. Yet, within that quiet preservation is a continuity that extends far beyond the instant it represents. The feather's structure, the arrangement of its barbs, the asymmetry that once guided air around it, all remain visible, a frozen gesture of something that was once in motion. Elsewhere, continuity persists in forms that never entered stone. A reptile rests at the edge of water, body still, eyes half closed, its posture shaped by a lineage that extends far into the past. The chemistry of its skin, the rhythm of its breath, the architecture of its senses carry forward patterns that have endured with only subtle change. Nearby, the fan-shaped leaves of a tree unfold in a geometry that has been repeated across ages, their veins tracing the same design that once opened beneath unfamiliar skies. In the evening, a faint resin scent rises from bark, a sharp, clean note released where wood has been exposed, a signal carried on air that has circulated through countless forests before this one. None of these moments declare their origin. They are part of the present, integrated into a world that appears complete in itself. Yet each one contains within it a connection that reaches backward, not as memory but as structure. The continuity is not symbolic. It is physical, chemical, biological, carried through unbroken sequences of replication and survival. Long before any of this could be observed, small bodies moved through shadowed ground, navigating a landscape filled with larger presences. They fed, avoided danger, rested, and reproduced, passing forward the traits that allowed them to persist. Those lineages did not pause or reset. They continued, generation after generation, adapting in small increments, each step anchored in what came before. The chain remained intact, linking distant ancestors to organisms that exist now, including those capable of reflecting on that continuity. To stand within the present is to stand at the end of a sequence that has never been interrupted. Every structure, every function, Every system has arrived through a process that did not stop. The distance in time does not separate, it accumulates, building complexity from repeated cycles of variation and persistence. The impression in stone, the living forms that echo earlier designs, the ongoing processes that shape air and land, all exist together as parts of the same continuum. Nothing has been left behind entirely. It has been transformed, integrated, carried forward into new configurations. Within this continuity, there is no clear boundary where one world ends and another begins. There is only transition, gradual and constant, shaping what exists without announcing the change. The present moment holds within it the result of all prior moments, assembled into a state that continues to evolve. The story has not concluded. It unfolds without pause, extending beyond any single observer, moving forward as it always has, through time that continues to open.